of Snake Mountain, and we stopped for a taste of water. It came from the ground into a little sparkling pool before it spilled over moss-covered rocks and across our path and down to join with the other streams making their way into the headwaters of the North Fork of the New River. Dave and Betty Martin were concerned about the impacts of new housing developments. Let me see, is this right there? New housing developments, this is Councilman, that were beginning on their side of Pottertown Gap. They worried about the impact of increasing numbers of wells on the fragile ecosystem of the watershed, and especially the underground water supplies. Rumors swirled around the neighborhood of a new gated community or possibly even a ski slope planned for the entire Elk Knob. The future was in the balance. So that summer, not that summer, that first year with classes, we also visited Joe Stevens. After 4 years in the Air Force during the Korean War, Joe and his wife Joyce ran Stevens' store, started by Joe's father. For 35 years, the store was more than a general mercantile. It was a community center, a gathering place to discuss daily news and events. Joe was also a founding member of the Creston Volunteer Fire Department. He knew all the stories, all the gossip. His father's store records document the barter economy that existed in the early 20th century as people traded farm goods, wild-crafted items, and labor for necessities for the store. And by the way, the store records are all archived in the W.L. Urey Appalachian collection of Belk Library, thanks to his family. We also visited Dora Wellington Horton, who grew up in the small African-American community at Creston. Dora Maxwell had attended school in the New Hope Church, married Ed Wellington sometime in the 1930s, and moved to Wellington property on Peak Road in Ashe County. Dora and Ed raised 7 children. Her family raised beans, tobacco, corn, and everything else they needed to subsist, as well as beef cattle, hogs, chickens, and, as she says, cats and dogs. When finally asked about how hard her life must have been, she observed, quote, that's a beautiful life. That was a beautiful life, living on the farm. I enjoyed my work and enjoyed my family. Yes, I enjoyed it. When my children was little, I enjoyed living there. You lived on the farm, you worked on the farm. You didn't think about it. Dora's husband, Ed, died in 1975, and she moved to Boone to look for work. There, she met and eventually married the widower, Reverend Rhonda Horton, who Sue mentioned talked about last week. Meat Camp Road begins at the stop sign where it meets North Carolina 194. Plan B stores on the right. The road takes us north along Meat Camp Creek to the gap between Elk Knob and Snake Mountain, and this is a picture of Elk Knob. At this gap, Elk Knob rises to an elevation of 5,520 feet. The gap marks the boundary of Tamarack or Pottertown. Meat Camp Road becomes Pottertown Road as it follows the stream of the New River across the Watauga County, Ashe County line. Pottertown Road then becomes Sutherland Road, taking us past the Creston Volunteer Fire Department substation and the Sutherland Methodist Church. The church has stood on the hill since 1885. It overlooks the confluence of the New River and Hoskins Forks and the stop sign at the junction with North Carolina 88. But long before roads were built, walking paths crossed the mountain, linking one place to another. From Tamarack, people could walk down to Sutherland and on to Mountain City or to Trade, Tennessee. Storekeeper Dave Maines remembered the mail carrier's route through Tamarack Post Office from Tamarack Post Office to Todd Post Office, back when, quote, stamps were 2 cents a piece. Dave's brothers carried the mail to Meat Camp and back to Todd. Lloyd Miller recalled walking from Meat Camp to Boone and back when he knew everyone who lived along the way. Pottertown Gap also served as a community commons, a place for revivals, camping and hiking, courting and partying away from prying eyes. The Gap was a borderland separating Meat Camp and Pottertown. Walking trails wound around the highest slopes, connected settlements, and served as routes for mail, trade, work, and courtships. This photograph is one of my actual favorites. It's a prize of the whole collection. It's of Council Maine's father and Edgar Eller's father and others who we also know, who had gathered at the Gap for one of the week-long revivals held every summer in the 1950s. Edgar Eller recalled that while souls were saved, entrepreneur storekeeper Dave Main sold sandwiches and drinks. The idea of a commons was brought to America by the Scots-Irish, who maintained a portion of the woods to be used communally, mostly for livestock, but also for hunting wild game, collecting honey, for wildcrafting, or digging roots and gathering leaves, bark, and other herbs that had medicinal uses, but also had market value. In the Civil War memoir, which I'll mention a little later, Neighbor to Neighbor, William Wilson describes a camping trip on the top of Elk Knob in about 1879. More than a century later, people go hiking and camping on top of mountains, often on other people's land, because people always thought of the mountaintops as common land, available for use by all. Council Maine explained there were a lot of people who would gather roots and herbs and bark. Back when I was little, we used to go anywhere and nobody would say anything to you. That was a way of life, you know. If I found something on your land, I could get it. Or if they found it on ours, they could get it. You didn't get these no trespassing signs. Seemed to me, people get this property, the first thing they do is put up a no trespassing sign, and we never did that. The tops of mountains were just for everybody. Well, then ceremonies at the Gap in 2002 celebrated an important event to secure the mountaintop for everybody. The acquisition by the North Carolina chapter of the Nature Conservancy of a 1,097 acre tract from Sterling Carroll, and the approval by the North Carolina General Assembly of the establishment of a state park. In 2005, a new community organization was formed and named the Elk Knob Community Heritage Organization, or ECHO. It's spelled weird. It's E-K-C-H-O, pronounced ECHO. My students and I look to it as a starting point for collaboration. The official opening of the park was celebrated in a community picnic on the grounds, September of 2005. As we studied how to build a sustainable life, we enjoyed our conversations with those who were sustaining themselves and their families. We learned about education, healthcare, community leadership, work, food, and fun. We heard stories about local events and traditions, transitions and traveling, kinship and the land, and all it has to offer. Here's another. This is Jim Sutherland with family photos that we duplicated that are on display at Elk Knob Community Day. From 2005 on, we worked with ECHO. And when it came time to develop the book, ECHO set the parameters of what we would include. And that is from stop sign on 194 to the stop sign at Sutherland. So from the first stop sign is Meat Camp. German Lutherans from Watauga County were here by the 1820s, including the families of Moretz, Weinbarger, Woodring, and Davis, and joining Millers, Greers, and others who were already established in the county. They were joined by Prophets, Norrises, Trivets, Wilsons, and others. The contemporary Meat Camp community features Plan B Store, the Meat Camp Volunteer Fire Department, Christmas Tree Farm, 6th respective churches. We began with William Weinbarger, who was interviewed in the 1960s, and the Weinbarger Mill, probably the most widely known institution in the meat camp community. Weinbarger Mill's been a landmark for about almost 150 years. William Weinbarger explains, old grandfather Moretz came to this country in about 1829 and bought a little mill down here on the creek. And he tore out that mill and put it on a big flour mill, and he brought the Weinbargers up here as carpenters and the Woodrings as carpenters, and also the Davises. He brought them along for rock masons, and he tore out the old wood dam across Meat Camp Creek and put in a rock dam. That's why I used the Davises for rock masons. And the Weinbargers helped him in the mill because they were carpenters. My grandfather Jacob Weinbarger married Sally Moretz and moved up here about 100 yards, and he built a mill of his own, Weinbarger Mill. It was built in 1873. It's been operating ever since by the same Weinbargers. My grandfather built it, and he died in 1883, and then my father, Hosey, and 3 other brothers heired it, and my father bought them out, and he owned it himself till he turned it over to me in about 1926, I think it was. And I've owned it ever since then. And I turned it over to my boy, Walter, a couple of years ago because I wasn't able to work it. It's been right about 100 years in operation, and it burnt down once in 1910. And since then, we've rebuilt it. We grind everything from corn on the cob to white flour. Well, of course, the corn on the cob, we just crush that for feed. Then we don't do much of that anymore. Then the white flour is made out of the wheat, recleaned and ground and bolted to the roller mill nowadays. We used to use burrs, French burrs. They come from France. We use it for buckwheat. There were other places people could get their corn ground, but ours was a real mill, kept in good shape and ground for everybody and anybody. And it was the only flour mill there was anywhere abouts for buckwheat, wheat, or rye. By the way, there's a very nice film on Walter Weinbarger running the mill in its last years when it was still very active, from Appalachia Film Studios, and it's called Waterground, if anybody's interested. It's also in the library. Woodrow Wilson Weinbarger says, quote, "When I was a boy, they named me after the first education governor they had. My father was a school teacher, and my mother was a school teacher, and he was educationally minded. And so with the big education governor, I got named Charles Brantley after Charles Brantley Aycock. My great uncle Carl called me the president, and that was easier to say than Charles Brantley. I didn't really have a choice. It was either the governor or the president. They didn't have birth certificates when I was born. I got a delayed birth certificate because I had to have one to get into the Marines. So I got it with Woodrow Wilson. My discharge has it on it too. So to be legal, I signed Woodrow Wilson. For the most part, just WW. I was raised up at the head of meat camp, and Papa was teaching school in Pottertown. My mother was from Boone. Do you know where 105 Extension starts? Well, right there on that bank, as you come up from the light, was where their home was. My grandfather owned all that land. There was a big maple tree and a big cool spring come right out of the rock. Woodrow also had provided a wonderful description of the East Tennessee and Western North Carolina Railroad, or Tweetsie line, that came along River Street, and how it rattled all the windows. He said there wasn't much to town then. There used to be wood sidewalks. The street was clay, and when it rained, it would be almost up to the axle with the wheels in the mud. We had to travel with horses and buggies. There where the bank used to be, at Farmer's Hardware, there was a water trough where you could pump your horse's water. When the First World War ended, all the soldiers from the county that was in the war was marching along. So we went because my Uncle Coy was going to be in the parade, and they still had plank sidewalks there. I guess that was the next year after I had polio, because the war was over in 1919. See, it was September 1918 when polio started. In November, I could walk again. I had polio when I was 5. A polio epidemic was all over the whole nation, and multitudes of young people and children died or were crippled. It was after I had polio when the Great Flu epidemic killed half the people in the world, and we all had it after getting over polio. Man, I remember how sick we were, all in the bed at the same time. I had an uncle that come down our work for at least a week. In December, we had the flu, and I know it was before Christmas because after I recovered, we went to the Lutheran church for the Christmas program. I lost my finger in 1959, December, that winter of the great snow, but and he's talking to the young woman who's actually interviewing him, said, you wasn't even born then, I guess. It's hard to realize the space between people and me about time. He says, oh, phooey, I'm not in the same world I was when I was growing up. Leonard Greer also talked about the natural disasters and flu and the polio epidemic and the chestnut blight and the flood of 1940, and then the snows of 1959-60, as well as a lot of other things. He says, in late winter, the weather developed a pattern of 2 snows a week, one on the weekend and one in the middle of the week. Each new forecast was for rain, but always came snow. It overwhelmed the highway department, and much of their equipment failed. Everything bogged down for a good reason. At our house, there were 44 inches of snow. He tells a couple of apocryphal stories that some of you probably have heard. He says, we had some helicopter flying around, and we saw a lot of relief work going on television, but most people expected to make it on their own. It was told that an isolated elderly lady in Ashe County was visited by the Red Cross to offer her aid. Never guessing their intent, she apologized for not being able to give anything that year. She said, it's been a bad winter. In a Watauga County story, he says Kyle Greer had moved to the grassy knob of Rich Mountain. Kyle was used to bad winters because he had lived most of his life on Long Hope Creek near Bald Mountain. Kyle, however, was old, a veteran of the Spanish-American War. What's more, he had a cut on his head with stitches that were due to come out. R.D. Hodges and other volunteers attempted to open the Junaluska Road to bring him in. They failed the first and second days, but were able to get there on the third day. They were too late, however. Kyle had gotten over on the south side where some snow had blown off and the remainder had softened in the sun. He walked several miles into town, had his stitches removed, got a few grocery items, and walked back. Margaret Miller was born in 1922. As a young woman, she went to work as a sales clerk at the Crest 5 and 10 cent store at the corner of King Street and Depot Street in Boone. She worked there until the store closed in the 1970s. Then she worked as a cashier at Rose's department store on Blowing Rock Road. When it closed, she moved to the Roses at Newmarket and worked there until it closed. She was in her 70s when she finally retired, and people recognized her from many years in retail. This was on her 90th birthday. Margaret recalls, quote, I went to school at Chestnut Grove School up the hill at the end of Chestnut Grove Road. There were chestnut trees all along the road. There's a little store at the end of the road up there, and you could bring the chestnuts down there and sell them for pencils or a little candy sometimes or something like that. You could pick up your pockets full, or if you had something to put them in, the road would just be covered in them. On a windy night, they would really pepper down. They were just wonderful. I wonder now why we would have sold them for candy, because they were so much better. Granddaughters of Claude and Minnie Prophet wrote of their grandmother, quote, Ma'am was a hard-working woman, always doing her share on the farm, gardening, cooking for farm hands, hired to help with the haying season, and harvesting the crops on their 135-acre farm. Her pinto beans, cream, potatoes, and cornbread were the best. She canned everything that could be canned to have plenty of food to feed the family through the winter. She churned buttermilk and made butter to eat with cornbread and biscuits. When her supplies of jelly or molasses were low, she would offer us grandchildren a biscuit with butter and sugar for a snack. It was delicious. She made pickles and kraut to fill oak barrels, enough to last until the next growing season. She spun wool for socks and made clothing and quilts for the household. She also kept 10 stands of bees for honey. Attired in an old piece of veiled fabric covering her face, she smoked the bees and robbed the honey. The story goes, when she died, someone told the family to go tell the bees that their master had died or the bees would die. The family thought it was foolish to do that, so they didn't. And the bees did die, but she says they said it was probably from neglect. On the north side of the gap is Tamarack, named for the lofty tamarack pines that grow there. The community is also called Pottertown, named for the many people named Potter who live there. Council Maine's family land extends from the road to the top of Snake Mountain. High on the mountain, a big rock juts out and marks what council considered, quote, the prettiest part. The snake and the elk are part of a range of high elevation amphibolite peaks, including the peak, treetop mountain that ring the 6-mile hanging valley of Long Hope. Council Maine was born in 1925 in Pottertown. Educated in Pottertown and Cove Creek schools, he owned and operated Maine motor sales for most of his life and lived in the Cove Creek community. He was active in the civic life of Watauga County, serving on communities and boards, including banks and schools and the Watauga County Hospital. He was known as a peacemaker for his ability to mediate discord in the community. He invited young people to climb up on his land for a full view of the Long Hope, the Elk, and on into Virginia, declaring that young people wouldn't get into trouble if they were hiking mountain trails. Council Maine died on March 2nd, 2009, and many still remember his generosity of spirit and his love of his mountains, and many continue to visit his land. He also talked about picking up chestnuts on the way to school and trading at Dave Maine's store for a pencil or a piece of candy. He said a lot of the forest back in the 30s was chestnut. The chestnut was the most valuable timber in this country. You know, it provided the nuts for the wildlife. And turkeys, they'd eat all those chestnut. And it was really good human food. We lost a valuable timber when we lost the chestnut. Council also remembers the flu of 1918. Killed 20 million people. My dad, right up there where they had the ceremony launching Elk Knob State Park, he had a sister live there, and that flu killed her. She's in that cemetery down there, and there was another couple there. His name was Charlie Maine. I don't remember his wife's name. He died one week, she died the next, left 4 or 5 children. My father said that everybody that got it, they died. Didn't make no difference how strong or weak, you got that flu, you died. I reckon they brought it here after World War I. Council always found humor and was a good storyteller. Did you hear about the preacher and the singer? This fellow had been singing in the choir, and another choir member told the preacher, said, I wish you'd have John get out of the choir. He just can't sing. We don't need him in the choir. The preacher went and told John what he said, and John said, I won't go back in the choir if that man says that about me. But then he added, they've been about 40 or 50 told me you couldn't preach. We interviewed Anna Potter on her porch in Pottertown. She said you had to dig yourself a sack of roots like ginseng to buy bread and stuff. We'd dig just anything that they bought. Black cohosh, burdock root. We traded with the roots. It's what I got my eating with. See, my husband worked and it took more to keep food, so I had to get out and dig roots in the wintertime. There was a store down there in the forks of the road. If I had roots to sell them, we bought things. I bought sugar, coffee, things like that. I never really had a ready-made dress. I made this dress I'm wearing. We made a garden every year. We raised our corn and wheat. That's what you made flour with. We had to go to the forks of the road to the grist mill to take the corn. We made cornbread and buckwheat bread. I strung a lot of green beans, strung beans, canned beans, and dried beans. You string up a thread with a needle and run through the beans and dry them. People call them leather breeches. I call them hay beans. When you put them in water, they can come back too. Then cook them. Just wash them clean, get them good and hot, put the meat in and cook them, and maybe add some lard, and they're good. I make dried apples too. Just peel them and core them, then take a needle and thread and string them up. Hang them up around the stove just as close as you can get them so they don't burn, and they'll be bone dry in 2 or 3 days. With 11 children, I did a whole lot of my own doctrine. Let's see, there it is. Make a kind of tea and give it to them, sweeten it, and they would sleep. Catnip tea, boneset tea, and stuff like that. Boneset's an herb. It's got a big flower on the top of it. Evelina Idol was born in 1939 along with her twin brother Leroy in Tamarack. Evelina married Bob Idol in 1960. She retired from New River Mental Health in 1996 and continued to be active in the Laurel Springs Baptist Church and a variety of volunteer groups, boards, and committees, including Elk Knob Community Heritage Organization, that is ECHO. Evelina shared with us the letters that her parents exchanged when they were courting. Lloyd Miller lived in Mead Camp and Leola Main lived in Pottertown, and the postman would carry letters over the mountain at no charge. She said Mama and Daddy would either walk or ride a horse to see each other. It was an hour or more by horseback ride. They would go to church together. Their courtship was in the late 20s to the early 30s. Their letters talk about a variety of things, ranging from their individual everyday activities to arranging meetings. Church was a common topic, especially. This is a letter from Leola to Lloyd, February 3rd, 1928, with the poem, Remember first, remember sweet, remember when we first did meet. I loved you then, I love you still, I love you now, and always will. And then from Lloyd to Leola, July 17th, 1929, honey's sweet, kraut sour, you say the date and I'll fix the hour. Evelina talks about her parents. She said, Mother was very proud, sophisticated lady in her own way. She wore suits, hats, and gloves to church. One suit she had was pink with a hat, and another was a burgundy suit with a tie. Mama made some of her clothes. She could quilt and sew too. Mama also had chickens, cows, milks, eggs, and made butter and buttermilk. She was a great gardener. She had a little raspberry patch at the corner of the garden. We would pick them by the gallons and sell some to neighbors. My mother was such a godly woman. She lived her faith. She had a special place where she liked to pray in the barn. Mama would kneel down to pray, and all us kids would kneel down with her. She prayed each time she went to the garden too. I can almost hear her thanking God for all the good things he had blessed her with, including her dear family. She also prayed earnestly for lost people and called out names of family members she wanted God to save. One of the greatest enjoyments in her life was getting to go to church and worshiping God. She would shout because she just got so filled with the Spirit. She would just shout all over the church. Two of my aunts, another lady, my uncle, who was the preacher, and her would get all happy and be having a good time in the Lord. My dad was Justice of the Peace, which gave him permission to marry people. He also was sometimes summoned to assist our sheriff with community problems. Daddy drove the school bus to Mabel Elementary and Cove Creek High School. He would help others with tobacco along with sharecropping. He would also help in the lunchroom at the high school. He also had a federal government program job. He had no exact permanent job. Everything was temporary. Daddy was a veterinarian of sorts too. He would be called on by farmers to help birthing baby calves. Daddy also learned to crochet from a lady from the area who was related to him, and then picked up cooking and quilting. He was probably in his 30s when he began to crochet and quilt. In the winter months, we would put up quilt frames, then it was a nightly family thing. After school work was out of the way, everybody would work on the quilt. Then it was put up to the ceiling to be out of the way. Father most likely picked up quilting from Mama. Mama did most of the picking out of fabric for quilting, mostly from scrap. Daddy helped pick out feed sack patterns. If he thought something would look nice on them, he would encourage them to pick a particular pattern. They would use the feed sacks for piecing and the plain feed sacks that looked like muslin for the quilt lining. Daddy loved to cook, and he was always asking someone to come and eat. He loved company. He would put on an apron and they would work together and fix a good Sunday lunch for everybody. Daddy picked up crocheting from Mother as well. He would make door panels from doilies. He would put them together to make door treatments. He would buy crochet thread on a big spool and would sit around at night in his spare time, putting it in the shape of a door and make tassels for the door. When our crops were completed, he would get to go to Tennessee. We would get to go to Tennessee to pick beans on Tommy Walsh's father's place. We all had a crush on Tommy. My Uncle Dave Maine would haul riders to the bean fields. We would get paid 50 cents a ride for each rider. He would be. I enjoyed going and could pick 20 or more bushels of beans per day, depending on how full the vines were. Pickers were paid 50 cents a bushel, and I sometimes picked 16 to 20 bushels a day. Anner Potter's children picked beans with me, and Pearlie and I would race to see who could pick faster. Another way I got school money was with my brother Leroy. We spent more time together, probably because of the bonds of love from being a twin. We would gather herbs in the summer, pick beans, and trap in order to have school money. It seemed natural for us to get up very early in the mornings, make our rounds, check our traps for muskrats and weasels. My job was to carry the flashlight, and I would follow Leroy to the traps we had set up along the creek. We would skin them and dry the hides. Wilcox Drug Company in Boone would pay us so much for each hide, as well as the herbs, including catnip, beadwood leaves, life plant, snakehead, and so on, that we collected with Mother. At Elk Knob Baptist Church, Daddy played the piano, led the song service, taught Sunday school, and said, quote, he could preach if it need be. He helped embalm people too, back when people did that at home. Daddy was the one who pushed to install the Sunday school room at the back and toilets. There was a beautiful baptizing place at the side of the church beside the picnic tables where they would pond up the creek with stones to make it deep enough. But I was baptized in Prophet's Grove Baptist Church, which is a meat camp where they would pond up Meat Camp Creek and have baptizing alongside where the parking lot is. Mother and Daddy took us to church and to revivals. We didn't make it a point to say what religion you were. You believed in God. Your faith was in God. It was not a denomination. I remember growing up that we went to other churches and different denominations. Edgar Eller was born in 1938 in Pottertown. Edgar and Patsy Eller have been married for more than 50 years. More than that now. In 1962, at his home on South Road, Edgar opened Eller's Body Shop, an automotive body repair shop, and he worked there with his son Scotty from 1900 until 2008, when Scotty took over most of the workload. Patsy Shaw Eller was born in 1941 and raised just across the North Carolina in Neva, Tennessee. Patsy moved to Pottertown following her marriage to Edgar in 1961. She's also an active member of ECHO and has been working hard planning the Elk Knob Community Day. Quote, she says, after May 6, 2011, I would have been in Pottertown for 50 years and I love it here. I've learned that some of the best people are in Pottertown, Tamarack. Patsy keeps the church record books dating from the year 1900 of the Elk Knob Missionary Baptist Church, one of the 4 churches on Sutherland, Pottertown Road. She says, I'll never forget the first time I went to church. It was the first Sunday I was there. Evelina Idol's daddy, Mr. Lloyd Miller, stood up in front of the congregation and said, the Lord has blessed us with a lot of things, but he's blessed us with another piano player now. I've played the piano ever since. Also, I've been a Sunday school teacher for years. Patsy's been chairing the Elk Knob Community Day Committee, the ECHO Committee. She said, I'd love for this community to have a museum, but that takes a lot of money, I know, but hopefully ECHO will go a long way. I started working on Community Day after our first meeting around Easter 2005. We usually start in May because it takes a lot to get all that together. Well, I didn't kill myself the first years, a couple of times, but the last 2 or 3, I've really got with it. 2008 was a great year. Over 500 people showed up. I was very excited to see that. But this past year in 2010, my sisters and one of my nephews and my niece came in, but honey, it was raining cats and dogs. It literally poured. My sister Barb looked like a drowned rat. I reckon I'll take charge again next year. They've already asked me, and Edgar said I wouldn't have it any other way. I love it. I guess that kind of stuff is my thing, bringing the community together. We even get a lot of people to come back that have left. I hadn't seen Yvonne Settle from Meat Camp in many years until our ECHO meetings. Seeing people that we haven't seen in a while thrills me and Edgar. I've fallen in love with them all over again. The Community Day also gives me the opportunity to learn about the people that left before I got here. Edgar tells me about them, and then I get to meet them. They're the nicest people. It's all held on that Saturday after Labor Day each year. Okay. In the course of the research for this class, we were shown a Civil War memoir that was profoundly moving. Caroline Wilson's husband, Isaac, a Confederate soldier, was home on furlough to plow his corn and return to join his troops. But he was shot and killed, and the memoir focuses on how Caroline Wilson and her 8 children survived the war in a border community fraught with conflict. The memoir was written by her youngest son, William, who became a missionary to Japan and then wrote this in his retirement to Durham. In the book, Neighbor to Neighbor, we also follow the fortunes of the family and the land from the Civil War to the present, with lots of genealogical references and photographs. In Sutherland, early in the century, there were many businesses in the valley. There was a boot and shoe shop, a tan yard, a law office, cheese factory, livery stable, post office, blacksmith shop, and a brickyard. There was even a saddle shop and a cattle scale going up to old Pottertown. In addition, there were 2 doctor's offices and a store. There was also a big school, Sutherland Academy. There were also 5 white 2-story farmhouses owned by Sutherland kin that spread up the river, and some of those are still standing. Today, there are a few houses, the beautiful Sutherland Methodist Church on the hill, and the little cinder block boating place. The shell of buildings remind us that 20th century economic and social forces saw thousands of people move away from rural places in northwest North Carolina. Yet these communities, though sometimes invisible, have rich, interested, and complicated histories. I chose to tell stories today that remind us that our neighborhoods weathered pandemics, debilitating snows, ecological disasters, and yet they survived and thrived through mutual aid, and they persist. Oh, there we go. Photograph taken by wonderful photographer Carl Gallet. I don't know if you know him. Finally, Sandra Ballard and I, in collaboration with ECHO, documented these and many other stories and photographs in the book, Voices from the Headwaters. ECHO members set the boundaries for the book, and as we organized and edited individual stories, they read and approved each interview. Trevor McKenzie created a CD with a number of the individual voices telling wonderful stories. My introductions to the three communities and his wonderful music, if you know Trevor and his work. These are available individually or together from the Appalachian Journal office at ASU. Also available is the Civil War memoir that I mentioned, Neighbor to Neighbor. And everything we collected is archived in the W.L. Urey Appalachian collection, the interviews, the photographs, the story records, and the letters. And I thank you very much for your attention. You have questions?
Thank you, Pat. Anybody can just speak out if you want.
Very interesting.
Thank you, June. Don't say anything.
That was great. That was great.
Pat, was Sutherland ever bigger than Boone?
Probably about the same size is all I can tell. And in fact, Dougherty was on the board of the Sutherland Academy. So there was definitely a connection. And at one point, one of those apocryphal stories said that they were looking to take Sutherland Academy and make it into a college. So that was sort of, there was a question of, could Appalachian State University have ended up here? And that would have changed the fate.
Huh.
That's true.
Questions, comments? We had a good time.
How many students actually worked on the project overall, would you say? How many years?
In the book, we tried to list, you can't see this, but we tried to list every student every year from 2000, actually from fall 2000 on to, is that me? Yeah, on to, yeah. So we've got, I think it was over, we just said over 100.
Okay.
But anyway, that many. And not all of them, we didn't include all the interviews. Like I started with Joe Stevens. We included his because he was the storekeeper kind of at the end of the valley, but we didn't include others like Mrs. Horton, because she was on Down Peak Road. Also, well, anyway, there were a number of interviews. We had gone on down towards the school. So, but we didn't include those, but we included the names of all the students who were in the class. And then for the interviews that we used, we included those by year, all the enrollment. And then for the interviews we actually used, the students are credited with doing those interviews. So it's about 100 and something.
Mm-hmm.
This is Pushpa. I'm not sure whether you spoke about this. Why is the area called Beat Camp? Where did the name come from?
Well, okay, another apocryphal story was that hunters would come up the New River from Virginia, cross over Pottertown Gap, and hunting expeditions, and then in meat camp they would butcher their game and prepare their game. And it said, there's the story that Daniel Boone also came through and was part of that process. So it was a hunter's camp initially, where the meat was processed down in the valley where they get away from the mountaintops. And I did not
Okay,
mention
thank
that.
you.
Yeah. Sutherland
Thank
was
you.
named for the family of Sutherland. Tamarack was named for the Tamarack pines. It was nicknamed Pottertown because of all the potters who lived there. And then Mead Camp was for hunting. And Elk Knob was named because there were elk on that mountain.
Is there any relationship between the Sutherland family in the old world of fame, of removal fame, and this Sutherland family?
Oh, tell me more what you're asking. What?
Um,
I don't know. Who was
Is
involved in removal?
is it Ireland?
No, I think they're English.
Yeah, English.
The Sutherlands were English. These Sutherlands,
Yeah.
and I can't remember the history. There's a really nice history in the Ashe, that series of the county history books that were done in the, maybe 80s. But there's a really nice, a few stories about the Sutherland family, and they're coming into the area. But I do believe they were English, and they were second generation coming from somewhere else.
Pat, this is
Yeah.
Jeff.
Hi, Jeff.
Hey there. Do you know the first families to arrive in this whole North Fork area and settled? Do you know would it have been the Sutherlands and the Potters? Who and what decade did the first people settle? Do you know?
I'm thinking it was like that early 1800s, because actually people are moving kind of up the valley, and they're going from what would be near West Jefferson, West Jefferson, and then kind of coming upriver, and then they get to Sutherland, and the Sutherland Valley is quite it's fertile. It's a wide, nice, fertile valley. And then settlement kind of proceeds on up the mountains and up the ridges later, because the land was poor and the people who didn't have much would go on up there. I'd say, and I just really, here's the book. And if y'all could talk to each other for a minute, I could look and see if I put it in there. But anyway, I can't. I would say early 1800s.
Yeah.
And I could look more precisely, because there is a good account of the first Sutherlands who were in there.
Mhm.
Pat, this
Yeah.
is Tom Rakowski.
Hi, Tom.
Hey, I looked into some of this early roads up here, and I noticed that from Jefferson up through that area, there was a stage that used to go there and
Yeah.
crossed over into a trade. And I was just wondering if there was any history about how they were settled. Did they come on the stage, or did they just family hear about it and then move from there?
That's a very good question. And at where Allie Funk lives, that was the stagecoach.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you know that on, what's the name of her road?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I've forgotten the name right now.
What's the name of it, honey?
Yeah. Anyway, there and Louis Acker and Allie Funk have live in a house that I think was an original stagecoach stop. There's a wonderful book that I'm trying to reach into my brain, published in around the turn of the last century, around 1900, called On Horseback.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you know that book?
Yeah, I've read that one. Yes.
Yeah, and I can't remember who's the author.
I don't remember that. I'm sorry. It's been a long time since I read it.
I know if we were prepared for this, but he has a wonderful talk about going over, going over various gaps, and staying on what was then would have been county line, and then going up to Creston, because there was a very prosperous settlement at Creston. If you know where the Creston Fire Department is, there's some lovely old houses in there. Doc Robinson lived in one that's in there. It's a big old 2-story house, and that was kind of a lively settlement as well. And people came over. Oh gosh, I can't think, Cut Laurel Gap. I think he talks about Cut Laurel coming down into Ashe County and then staying in Creston at the home of the people whose name I can't remember. But anyway, so they're following those trails. What was interesting to me in the Civil War memoir is that I live now on the fork of Hoskins Fork and Brushy Fork Road. And the Civil War memoir talks about people coming over from Tennessee, marauders. So there was a very active trail going over the mountain from Tennessee, although it was pretty steep. It was steeper than some of the other paths. But they would come over into Tennessee from Tennessee. So there was a border conflict that was pretty serious because East Tennessee was had Union sympathies as a Union stronghold during the Civil War, much later.
Pat, I have a question.
Yeah.
It's Marilyn.
Hi, Marilyn.
I want to know what has happened to the Martin property. Do they still own that property? How are the Martins
Yes.
Yeah,
and their family?
Betty was up, I think talked to you, Jeff, right? You ran into her, you and Helen ran
yeah,
into her?
we did last year. Yeah, they're still there and they have their land. They still keep, the family keeps it there.
Okay.
Right, and I think they go camp up there sometimes. Yeah, I mean, the children and grandchildren, they built a platform for camping and they stay in the cabin.
Mhm.
And I think that they have, a brother owns the adjoining piece of land.
Okay. My other question has to do with Pottertown. When I came here in the mid-70s, I was told don't go near Pottertown because it's too dangerous. And I know there's some people on this Zoom who have lived here a lot longer than that. So I'm curious, what was the truth behind all of that?
Well, I'll first comment that I also, when we first came to ASU, we lived at meat camp and several people in my department said, oh, meat camp. Oh, that's a scary place. And I thought, oh, I don't think so. But then I got to meat camp and people said, don't go to Pottertown. It's a dangerous place. So I have been intrigued. And one of the reasons I really developed this course in 2000 was to see if I could understand and unpack that whole notion. And there are great stories of what happened. There was a murder, there were murders, but then and then there was a kind of a notorious murder that made the state newspapers. And I mean, not notorious, it was like a manhunt that ended up in a killing, and it made the state newspapers. And from then on, the headlines were like something about those Potter men. And then from then on, it became a thing, became widespread and part of the myth, what I would call the myth making.
What years are we talking about?
Oh, gosh. Can somebody help me here? I'm thinking about 1915,
Okay.
early in the century. But maybe, yeah. And there's a book, who was it? Anyway, there's several books on that. And I did an article that's in a collection that kind of tries to summarize that whole story, which I would be glad to share with anybody. It's behind me on a shelf.
There's that
But
book.
anyway, that was one of the things that intrigued me, and we did talk a lot with people. And in this book, Council Maine talks about, some of those stories and the issues and the stereotyping that happened, and how difficult it was sometimes because of the stereotypes and the jokes and everything that kind of swirled around Boone constantly about Pottertown, and I'm sure we've all heard them. So anyway, that was one of the intriguing things for me to figure it out and to be there and interview people who live their lives.
Pat,
Yeah.
Pat, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Gail. Hi, when I was an intern, I guess in 71, perhaps at New River,
Yeah. Right.
we were, I was a psychologist, but the nurse there often invited me to make home visits, which we did, to give prolixin shots and medication that people were not able or inclined to come in to get. Anyway, Pottertown was one of the most interesting places in that we had heard the stories also, of course, and got to visit quite a few up in the mountain places, and being from beach area, North Carolina, I was intrigued with the how people got around through creeks and whatnot and got stuck and had to walk. But I remember my first visit to a home in Pottertown, whose last names were Carter, I think. The house, it was cold. It was very cold. It was in the middle of winter, snow. It was a one-room house, and you could actually see the daylight. When you were sitting inside, you could see the daylight through the boards. But there was a large family that lived there. We were there to see one of the sons, and nurse was going to give him a shot. But the whole family kind of stood outside and peeked in to watch, to make sure we were, I guess not doing anything bad. But that was my first experience with Pottertown. So I guess I did adopt the caution. Of course, since then, I know lots of people from Pottertown, and it is a wonderful place. But also when we were getting Oasis together to help with domestic violence, our first woman that we helped her, actually bought her a bus ticket to get to Georgia, was from Pottertown, married to a Potter, and had almost been beaten to death several times. So I had those experiences of going with social workers from DSS to rescue kids and whatnot, and saw that the part that the myth maker, I don't know, it wasn't all myths of Pottertown, but I'm glad through the years I also got to know the community in a different way. But they're like everywhere. There's some there was some unfortunate, amazingly poverty-laden situations in that area.
Yep, exactly. Well, I wrote one piece where I called it the cultural politics of elevation. People who had less and less were in the less desirable land, and had harder times. It was much more difficult. Yeah.
Pat?
Yes.
Have you read the book by Tom Rusher?
That's what I was trying to remember. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
He has a story about Boone Potter, I think was the name.
Boone Potter.
Right.
Exactly.
So it's an interesting story.
Yeah. Tom Rusher is one who I think has so much of that.
Isn't there another one by a South? I had a student who's a South, Michael and Ken.
Stan South. Yeah. Michael and Ken.
Right.
Right.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
The community was very, very strong and very much together. Would you say that's the case today? Are there a lot of young people leaving the community? Are there many social problems today that didn't appear in the earlier days? Can you comment something on that?
Do we have anyone from Meetup? I think we do. Pat, are you there still? Pat Coles?
Yeah.
Yes. You want to speak to that, or? You don't have to. Pat's also an ECHO member, and then I don't mean to bring attention, but I would say it's complicated. People are leaving, and people are also coming back. Young people are. I think families are joining their kin.
Mhm.
But do you have any response, Pat? I was trying to think of who else lives.
I
in-
think you're right. I mean, the mountain people kind of take care of each other, and they normally offer, if a child moves away and has problems, or they can't make it financially, that they'll come back home, and that's just kind of the tradition, I think, to take care of each other. And Pottertown, because I lived in meat camp, grew up in meat camp, and I too heard, oh, Pottertown's a scary place. And I didn't know where Pottertown was. It's just a little, like you blink your eye and it's not a big town or anything like that. And it's mostly just kinfolk fighting. I think if you were from Boone and driving through, you were safe, you were okay. It's mostly they just feuded among themselves. So.
But I would say also young people move away because there's no, they move away from, the high country because they can't find jobs, or they go off to college and they find jobs somewhere else, or they marry someone else and they go off somewhere else. But I've also seen families, more families coming back together with children moving back in around their parents in some cases. I think that's a lot more acceptable than it was 20 years ago, or it's a more desirable alternative. I think 20 years ago, everybody was supposed to leave. You graduate from college and you leave, or you graduate from high school at your high school and you go somewhere else. But I think it's a lot different now. It's a different time. And some of you, I think all of you can speak to that in a different way.
I want to say something about the, not to overhype violence. And this is a little interracial story. And this happened with me and the Boylans. We were coming back from a movie and coming up, through meat camp, going up to the top of Snake. And it was about 10 in the evening. And there was this big 18-wheeler that was stuck on those last hairpin turns. And I got out and went up, and the driver was, the driver was this black fellow. And he said, "Where am I?" And he had gotten off. He wasn't supposed to bring that 18-wheeler up there for sure. Anyway, we got it, told him where he was, and he finally got on the radio, and they said they're going to bring a big, crane up there and get him out. I went back the next morning, and it was gone. And I talked to Len Wilson over here, our next door neighbor, Pat. Yeah. And Len said, I said, he saw those Confederate flags, I'm sure, and I'll bet he was kind of worried. But, and he said, they wouldn't have done anything to him. He said, they would have helped him because some of those guys are truckers and they would feel sorry for him, And so I just kind of wanted to throw that into the mix. That's how Len saw it anyway. So that he wouldn't have had any problem at all there.
I totally agree, Jeff. They're very helpful. You can, but I don't know, the stigma attached to growing up here and close to Pottertown was kind of hard, but it's a great place. I love being from here. And anyway, thanks.
All right. Well,
okay.
And one more question. You mentioned that the people came around 1800. Would the Scots-Irish have come earlier into the area, as I seem to understand? Probably 17.
In the yes, there were most of the records in this area were around 1800 and the 1820s and so forth. The Scotch, Irish, Germans, English, Swiss, French were coming into this area. It wasn't dominated by Scots Irish, in fact, more English. And I think on this side of the mountain in Ashe County, in the Sutherland Valley. And I just can't remember. Anybody can
Mhm.
help me out when that first settlement happens?
Because they seem to speak also very old English. I've met quite a few Scot-Irish people here, and you know, it's like they still use the old English words. They, you know, the language has not changed very much.
Interesting.
If I might jump in, my name is Ginger, and I'm calling on the phone. And I've relocated to the high country. I in Boone. Initially, I was at the KOA off of 194. Excuse me. And I've been here for like a year and a half. And my father put in a career in the military. I am actually from Montana, and of all ranchland, I might add. And of all the places I've lived as a result of my father's occupation being Air Force and my former husband being Navy, I have in total lived in 13 states in a foreign country. And I can say hands down that of all the places I live, I absolutely, positively am gaga over the high country. And I hope never to leave. This is a treasure. This is an absolute jewel. Thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. That's a good kind of closing comment, don't you think?